On July 16, 1969, a rocket called Saturn V lifted off from Cape Kennedy, Florida. It carried 3 American astronauts toward the moon. 4 days later, 2 of them landed. It was the most watched event in human history. The man who built that rocket was Arthur Rudolph. He was NASA's project director for the Saturn V. He received the NASA Distinguished Service Award, the highest honor the agency could give. In 1944, Arthur Rudolph had watched 12 men being hanged. Their hands were tied behind their backs. Pieces of timber had been placed in their mouths so they could not scream. Ropes were looped around their necks, and they were slowly lifted into the air by overhead cranes in an underground factory in the Harz Mountains of Germany. Rudolph ordered the bodies to remain hanging for 12 hours so that 2 full shifts of workers could see them and understand the warning. The workers were concentration camp prisoners, slaves, building V-2 rockets for the Third Reich, and Rudolph was their overseer. In 1984, 15 years after the moon landing, the United States government investigated Rudolph for war crimes. He renounced his American citizenship and left the country to avoid prosecution. He kept his NASA pension. Rudolph was not alone. He was one of more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians brought to the United States after World War II under a secret program called Operation Paperclip. Many of them had Nazi records. Some had overseen slave labor. Some had conducted experiments on human beings. The United States government knew President Truman had ordered that no Nazi members be recruited. The memo that authorized Operation Paperclip was never shown to him. To understand how Operation Paperclip came to exist, you need to understand the spring of 1945. Allied forces were advancing into Germany from 2 directions simultaneously. From the west, American and British armies were crossing the Rhine and pushing east through the industrial heartland of the Reich. From the east, the Soviet Red Army was driving west through Poland and into Germany, closing on Berlin from the opposite direction. Both sides knew that Germany was finished. Both sides also knew that Germany had developed military technology during the war that neither possessed. The V-2 ballistic missile was the most visible example. It was the world's first guided long-range ballistic missile, a weapon that traveled at supersonic speed, arrived without warning, and could not be shot down with any existing technology. Between 1944 and 1945, approximately 3,000 V-2s were launched against London, Antwerp, and Liège. They killed approximately 9,000 people, but what the Americans and Soviets wanted was not the missiles themselves. What they wanted were the men who had designed them. The Germans had also been working on jet aircraft, advanced submarine technology, chemical and biological weapons programs, high-altitude aviation medicine, and exotic propulsion systems that American and Soviet engineers had not yet approached. The war had compressed a decade of technological development into 6 years of desperate innovation. The men who had done that work were now scattered across a collapsing country, trying to decide whether to surrender to the Americans or the Soviets, or simply disappear. The race to find them began before the war in Europe had officially ended. In 1945, the Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, a joint American and British organization of more than 3,000 technical experts, was given the task of moving behind the advancing Allied front lines, identifying German research facilities, and securing whatever they found before the Soviets arrived. They were looking for documents, equipment, prototypes, and people. The most significant early discovery was not a weapon. It was a piece of paper pulled from a university toilet. In March 1945, a lab technician at the University of Bonn found a crumpled, partially dissolved document floating in one of the building's toilets. German officials had been attempting to destroy records as Allied forces approached. This particular document had not made it all the way down. The document was the Osenberg list, a register of Germany's most valuable scientists and engineers, compiled during the war by Werner Osenberg, who had been tasked with identifying which researchers were too valuable to be sent to the front. In 1942, more than 15,000 scientists and engineers had been pulled from combat units and returned to their laboratories on the basis of this list. The list told the Americans exactly who to look for. The primary target was Wernher von Braun and his team at the Rocket Research Center in Peenemünde on the Baltic coast. Von Braun was 33 years old in 1945. He had been the technical director of the V2 program, the man most responsible for turning the theoretical possibility of a long-range ballistic missile into a functioning weapon. He was also a member of the Nazi Party. He had joined in 1937. He held the rank of SS Sturmbannführer, the SS equivalent of Major, having been commissioned in 1940 at the personal insistence of Heinrich Himmler, who wanted SS officers embedded in every major weapons program. As the war collapsed around him, von Braun made a series of decisions that reflected a calculation he had been making for some time. He wanted to work for the Americans, not because he had any particular loyalty to American values or the Allied cause, but because he understood that the Americans would give him resources to continue his rocket program, the program he had spent his entire career building. The Soviet Union was an alternative, but von Braun had a specific fear of the Soviets rooted in what the German military had done in the East. He loaded his team onto trains and moved them south, away from the advancing Soviets and toward the American lines. He gave himself up to the Americans on May 2nd, 1945. The Americans had been looking for him. A team under Major Robert Staver had been specifically tasked with finding von Braun and securing his cooperation before anyone else could. The meeting was both sides getting what they wanted. Von Braun wanted a rocket program. The Americans wanted von Braun. But von Braun did not come alone. He came with his team, more than 100 engineers who had worked on the V2 at Peenemünde and later at the Mittelwerk factory in the Harz Mountains, and that was where the problem lived. The Mittelwerk was not a conventional factory. It was an underground complex carved into the mountains near Nordhausen, a network of tunnels and chambers built by concentration camp prisoners from the Mittelbau-Dora camp, located less than 2 miles away. The prisoners who built the tunnels then became the workers who assembled the rockets inside them. They worked in conditions that the German medical system documented in detail, not out of concern for the workers, but because the mortality rate was affecting production. Men died of exhaustion, starvation, beatings, and exposure to the propellants used in rocket assembly. They were hanged for sabotage, real or suspected, on the cranes used to move rocket components. In the entire history of the V2 program, approximately 20,000 people died in the construction and assembly of the weapons at Mittelwerk and Dora. The V2 killed approximately 9,000 people in the cities it struck. More people died building the weapon than were killed by it. Von Braun had visited the Mittelwerk on multiple occasions. He had visited Buchenwald concentration camp personally to select which prisoners would be transferred to Dora for rocket production. A memo in von Braun's own handwriting, dated August 15, 1944, describes his visit to Buchenwald and his arrangements for the transfer of prisoners to the V2 production facility. He later said he had been aware of the conditions at the plant. He said he had found them repulsive. He said he had felt helpless to change them. Arthur Rudolph had no such ambiguity in the documentary record. Rudolph was the chief engineer of V2 production at the Mittelwerk. He had personally recommended, in an April 1943 memo, that the rocket program adopt SS concentration camp labor, after visiting a Heinkel aircraft factory and observing how effectively the system exploited prisoners. He was present on November 4, 1944, when 12 prisoners accused of sabotage were publicly hanged in the main assembly tunnel. He ordered the bodies to remain suspended for 12 hours to cover 2 full work shifts so that the maximum number of workers would see them and understand the consequence of any further resistance. He watched them die. These were the men that Operation Paperclip was designed to bring to the United States, and the American officials who ran the program knew exactly what was in their records. The official story of Operation Paperclip was straightforward. The United States needed German scientific expertise to counter the growing Soviet military threat. The men being recruited were scientists, technicians, engineers, researchers. Their Nazi affiliations were incidental to their scientific value, and President Truman had been clear: no Nazi members. The reality was different in every particular. In July 1945, the Joint Chiefs of Staff released a classified memorandum titled Exploitation of German Specialists in Science and Technology in the United States. The memo described the German scientists as chosen, rare minds whose continuing intellectual productivity we wish to use. It authorized the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, the JIOA, to bring these men to America. The memo was never shown to President Truman. The JIOA was given a specific problem. Many of the scientists they wanted to recruit had records that would make them ineligible under Truman's directive. They were Nazi Party members, some held SS rank, some had direct connections to forced labor operations or weapons programs that had used concentration camp prisoners. The JIOA's solution was systematic. They reviewed the security dossiers compiled on each scientist. For the men they wanted, the men with the most valuable expertise, they attached a paperclip to the file. The paperclip did not mean approved. The paperclip meant, give this file only a cursory review. Do not look too closely. For scientists with particularly problematic records, the JIOA went further. Passages were removed from security reports. Nazi Party memberships were described as nominal and coerced. SS ranks were omitted or minimized. Records of involvement with slave labor were deleted entirely. The State Department, which was supposed to vet the records, was given sanitized versions. Werner von Braun's security file went through multiple revisions. His SS rank was initially included in the documentation. It was later removed. His membership in the Nazi Party was described as something he had joined reluctantly under professional pressure, not as an ideological commitment. His visits to Buchenwald and his documented involvement in decisions about prisoner labor did not appear in the version of his file that was used for immigration clearance. The man who arrived in America in September 1945, on paper, had a past that was essentially clean. Von Braun and his team were brought first to Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas, and to White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. They were brought over as War Department Special Employees, a designation that sidestepped normal immigration procedures and the requirement for background checks that those procedures would have entailed. They were not immigrants. They were not citizens. They were employees of the War Department living on military bases, working on military projects in a legal status that had been invented specifically to accommodate people who could not enter the country through normal channels. The work they did at Fort Bliss and White Sands was officially described as advisory, helping American engineers understand German rocket technology. In practice, von Braun's team was rebuilding the V-2 program on American soil. They had brought with them the technical documentation for the V-2, an operation called Special Mission V-2 had recovered parts for 100 missiles from the Mittelwerk on 341 railroad cars before the Soviets arrived. The parts, the documentation, and the men who had built the original were now all in the American Southwest. The Soviets had not been idle. Operation Osenberg, the Soviet counterpart to Paperclip, was launched on the night of October 22, 1946. In a single coordinated operation, Soviet forces moved simultaneously on research facilities across East Germany, loading scientists, engineers, their families, and their equipment onto trains bound for the Soviet Union. Approximately 20,500 specialists and 4,000 family members were relocated to the USSR in one night. They had no choice. They were not recruited. They were taken. The American approach was more subtle, but the underlying dynamic was identical. Both superpowers were engaged in the systematic extraction of German expertise, and neither was particularly concerned with the wartime records of the men they were extracting. The Cold War had begun. The moral accounting of the war was already being subordinated to the strategic demands of the next conflict. By 1950, von Braun's team had been transferred from Fort Bliss to Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. The work had shifted from advisory to operational. They were no longer explaining how German rockets worked. They were building American ones. The Redstone missile, which would become the first American ballistic missile deployed with nuclear warhead, was developed by von Braun's team. The Jupiter missile followed. Then, the Redstone launch vehicle that would put America's first satellite, Explorer 1, into orbit in 1958, 2 months after Sputnik had demonstrated that the Soviets were ahead in the space race. The space race was the moment when the calculation behind Paperclip became publicly visible, and when the men who ran the program understood that they had made a decision that was going to be very difficult to revisit. Von Braun had become America's rocket man. He appeared on television with Walt Disney, explaining space travel to American families. He was on the cover of Time magazine. He was celebrated as the embodiment of American technological ambition, the man who would take the country to the stars. His Nazi past was not secret exactly. It was known to the people who had recruited him, known to the military, known at senior levels of the government. It was simply not discussed publicly. The journalists who tried to raise it in the late 1940s found limited traction. The country was in the early grip of Cold War anxiety, and the argument that German scientific talent was essential to American security was compelling to most people who heard it. There was one American who did not find it compelling. Her name was Henrietta Lacks, though her story is a different one. The person who objected most loudly and most persistently to Operation Paperclip was Albert Einstein. Einstein, who had fled Nazi Germany himself, who had lost colleagues to the camps, who understood in personal terms what the Nazi regime had been, wrote directly to President Truman in 1947 to protest the recruitment of German scientists whose records included Nazi party membership and involvement with war crimes programs. He was not the only one. The Federation of American Scientists objected. Veterans organizations objected. Several members of Congress raised questions. The State Department's own representatives on the JIOA committee raised objections about specific scientists whose records were too problematic to be sanitized convincingly. None of it stopped the program. The argument that won every time the objections were raised was the same. The Soviets are doing the same thing. If we don't take these men, the Soviets will. The scientific value outweighs the moral cost. We are at war, a different kind of war than the one just ended, but a war nonetheless. And in war, you use what you have. One case illustrated the contradiction more sharply than any other. Walter Schreiber was a German physician who had been involved in human experimentation at Nazi concentration camps. He was recruited under Paperclip and brought to the United States to work on biological warfare research for the Air Force School of Aviation Medicine in Texas. His record, which included direct involvement in experiments that killed prisoners, had been reviewed and sanitized before his immigration was approved. In 1952, a newspaper investigation by the Boston Globe and columnist Drew Pearson exposed Schreiber's wartime record publicly. The Air Force response was not to investigate or prosecute. The Air Force quietly arranged for Schreiber to be relocated to Argentina, where he lived out the remainder of his life without facing any legal accountability. The pattern repeated across dozens of cases. When a scientist's record became publicly known and the political cost of maintaining him exceeded the scientific benefit, the solution was relocation, not accountability. The scientists were not prosecuted. They were moved. Because prosecuting them would require explaining how they had gotten into the country in the first place and what the government had done to their files to make that possible. On July 16, 1969, the day Apollo 11 lifted off, Arthur Rudolph was 53 days away from his 63rd birthday. He had lived in the United States for 24 years. He had an American wife, an American daughter, an American pension, and an American award for his contribution to the greatest technological achievement in human history. He had, by any surface measure, become American. He had never been asked to account for what he had seen in the tunnels at Mittelwerk. The 12 men on the cranes, the 2 shifts of prisoners who filed past the bodies, the systematic destruction of human beings in the service of rocket production. He had been asked about it in security interviews, in routine background checks that had been conducted at various points in his American career. He had answered carefully. He had said what was necessary, and the answers had been accepted because accepting them was easier than examining them. In 1979, a Justice Department attorney named Eli Rosenbaum was reading a book about the post-war rocket program. He came across a reference to Arthur Rudolph and the role he had played in managing production at Mittelwerk. He went to the National Archives and began pulling the files. What he found was a record that the JIOA had attempted to suppress, but had not entirely succeeded in destroying. Rudolph's Nazi party card number 193418, his SS rank, captain, his April 1943 memo recommending the adoption of concentration camp labor, his presence at the November 1944 hanging, his signature on documents authorizing the use of prisoner labor for V-2 production. In September 1982, Rudolph received a letter requesting an interview with the OSI, the Office of Special Investigations, the Justice Department unit that had been established in 1979 specifically to investigate Nazi war criminals living in the United States. He came to the interview believing it was routine. It was not routine. Over 3 interviews in 1982 and 1983, investigators confronted Rudolph with the documentary evidence of what he had done at Mittelwerk. He did not deny it. He could not deny it. The documents bore his name. On November 28, 1983, Rudolph signed an agreement with the OSI. He would renounce his American citizenship. He would leave the United States voluntarily. In exchange, he would not be prosecuted. His wife and daughter's citizenship would not be in jeopardy. He would retain his government pension and his Social Security benefits. In March 1984, Arthur and Martha Rudolph boarded a flight to West Germany. He renounced his citizenship upon arrival. He had been an American for 39 years. He had helped build the rocket that put men on the moon. He had also, 40 years earlier, watched 12 men die on cranes in an underground factory and ordered their bodies to remain hanging so that the workers below would understand the cost of resistance. Von Braun had died in 1977, 7 years before the Rudolph investigation reached its conclusion. He died as an American hero. His SS membership had become more widely known in the 1980s, when Justice Department files on Rudolph were released and reporters began pulling the connected records. East Germany had tried to publicize his SS rank in the 1960s. The Western press had largely ignored it. He never faced any legal proceedings. He received the National Medal of Science in 1975, 2 years before his death. NASA's official biography of von Braun, as it existed for decades, ran for several paragraphs without mentioning his Nazi Party membership, his SS rank, or his visits to Buchenwald. In 2023, the agency's online biography was updated to include 2 sentences about his use of slave labor and his membership in the Nazi Party and SS. 2 sentences after 78 years. The question that the Rudolph case forced into the open, and that the von Braun case had always implicitly contained, was the question that Operation Paperclip had been designed to avoid asking. Was it worth it? Not the rocket program, not the space race, not the Cold War technology advantage, but the specific decision to recruit men whose records included slave labor, human experimentation, and direct participation in the machinery of the Nazi state. To sanitize those records, bring those men to America, give them citizenship and awards and pensions, and then to discover, 4 decades later, that what had been done could not be fully undone, but also could not be fully acknowledged. Was it worth it? The men who made the decision in 1945 would have said yes. The prisoners at Dora were not available to weigh in. Operation Paperclip's technological legacy is not in dispute. The German scientists and engineers brought to the United States contributed directly to programs that defined American military and scientific capability for the second half of the 20th century. The Redstone missile, the Jupiter missile, the Explorer-1 satellite, the Mercury and Gemini programs, and the Saturn V, the most powerful rocket ever built, which carried 24 American astronauts to the vicinity of the Moon and put 12 of them on its surface. The program has been valued at $10 billion in patents and industrial processes alone. The Cold War arms race and space race outcomes were shaped in measurable ways by the decisions made in 1945 to find those men and bring them to the United States instead of the Soviet Union. The Soviet program, built on the parallel extraction of German expertise through Operation Osenberg, had its own rocket successes. Sputnik in 1957, Yuri Gagarin in 1961, that demonstrated the Germans had contributed to both sides of the race with roughly comparable effect. The man who led the Soviet rocket program, Sergei Korolev, was a native Russian who had spent years in the Gulag before being released to lead the program that would beat the Americans into space. He died in 1966, before the moon landing, his identity as the chief designer of the Soviet space program classified by the Soviet government to prevent him from becoming a target for Western intelligence. The parallel histories of the 2 programs, one built on recruited Nazis, one built on a released political prisoner, is not a symmetry that either government ever found it comfortable to examine closely. The moral accounting of Operation Paperclip took decades to emerge, and it emerged only partially. The JIOA files on the scientists were declassified under the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act, passed in 1998, more than 50 years after the program had begun. The declassified records showed in granular detail what had been done to the files to make the scientists admissible: the deletions, the rewrites. The security reports that described men as nominal Nazis under professional pressure when the underlying documents showed party membership, SS rank, and in some cases direct involvement in war crimes. The irony that ran through the entirety of the Paperclip program was one that its architects had never had to confront publicly. The United States had fought the Second World War in part to defeat a regime that had committed systematic crimes against humanity, crimes whose perpetrators the Allies had committed themselves to prosecuting at Nuremberg. The Nuremberg trials, which ran from 1945 to 1949, convicted 24 Nazi leaders of war crimes and crimes against humanity. 12 were sentenced to death. At the same time that those trials were ongoing, at the same time that American prosecutors were arguing before an international tribunal that the use of slave labor was a crime against humanity that demanded the ultimate punishment. American military officials were recruiting the engineers who had overseen that slave labor, sanitizing their files, and installing them on military bases in Texas. The prosecuted and the recruited were in many cases doing the same kinds of work in the same kinds of facilities in the same years. The difference between them was whether the Americans had decided their expertise was useful. Arthur Rudolph moved to West Germany in 1984. West Germany investigated him and in 1987 determined there was insufficient evidence to prosecute. He lived in Hamburg until his death on January 1, 1996. He was 89 years old. He died a German citizen. His American citizenship never restored, despite petitions from former colleagues who argued that the OSI had treated him unfairly. Former members of the von Braun rocket team established an Old Timers Defense Fund, for Rudolph, and petitioned President Reagan to restore his citizenship. Senator Jeremiah Denton of Alabama, representing the state where the Marshall Space Flight Center was located, called for congressional hearings on the case. The FBI told Denton that Rudolph's record was such that there is no question that he is a war criminal. Werner von Braun is memorialized in multiple ways in the United States. There is a von Braun Center in Huntsville, Alabama, an arena and entertainment complex named after him. There is a crater on the moon named Von Braun. There is a crater on Mars named Von Braun. NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, which he led for a decade, stands where he built the rockets that changed the century. The men who died in the tunnels at Dora do not have craters on the moon. Most of them do not have graves that can be identified individually. They were concentration camp prisoners, their deaths recorded in the camp's ledgers with the same bureaucratic precision that had recorded their arrival. 20,000 of them, building a weapon that the man who designed it described in later years as his ticket to space. The families of Operation Paperclip scientists who settled in Huntsville, Alabama, the German community that took root there in the 1950s, have been the subject of historical study by scholars who documented how those families navigated the complexity of their fathers' and grandfathers' pasts in the American South during the Civil Rights era. Some of the children knew. Some were told only partial truths. Some learned the full record when the files were declassified and journalists published what they found. The community that formed around the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville in the 1950s was in many ways a normal American community. Suburban houses, school boards, churches, a local economy built around the aerospace industry. And underneath it, the same question that ran through the entire program. The question was never formally asked in any official government proceeding. The Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations handled individual cases, Rudolph and several others whose records came to light through declassified documents. But there was never a congressional hearing into Operation Paperclip itself, never a formal government inquiry into the decision to recruit men whose records had been sanitized. Never an official acknowledgement that the program had violated the president's own directive by recruiting Nazi Party members, because the memo that authorized that recruitment had been kept from the president. The Saturn V rocket still holds the record for the most powerful launch vehicle ever operated. No rocket built since has carried as much mass to orbit. It remains, more than 50 years later, the engineering pinnacle of the human spaceflight program. It was designed by a team that included men who had built their earlier work on the bodies of the dead at Dora. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and the discomfort of holding both of them in the same frame is precisely the discomfort that Operation Paperclip was designed to make it unnecessary to feel. In 2023, NASA's official biography of von Braun was quietly updated to include a mention of his Nazi past. 2 sentences in 7 paragraphs. The agency's chief historian said, in a statement released that year, NASA recognizes the difficult duality of both von Braun's contributions to our space program and his association with the Nazi Party. Difficult duality. The prisoners at Dora did not have the option of describing their experience as a difficult duality. They had only the tunnels, the cold, the rockets taking shape above them, and the cranes. And for 20,000 of them, in the end, only the cranes.